Warmly welcome everybody out here. I'm really happy to see such a wonderful gathering, despite being a holiday and Gudi Padwa. To all of you, of course, Gudi Padwa greetings today. Wish you a happy New Year. We're very delighted to have Naresh Fernandes with us. This is something we had planned with Literature Live a while back with Anil Dharkar. Unfortunately, it clashed with the Tehelka week in November, so they have the Literature Live at the same time as Tehelka. So we were planning to get all the writers down at the same time. It did not happen. Margaret was pushing it very hard, but still it didn't work. And, you know, if somebody can't, I mean, Margaret is the person who tries very hard despite that it didn't work, you know. So no efforts were spared. So this is the first time we're having an event with Literature Live. And we have a person like Naresh Fernandes to kickstart this entire thing. Thank you very much, Naresh, for coming here. A round of applause for Naresh, please. And now I'll hand it over to Shamali to introduce Naresh.
Good evening and welcome to Sunaparanta. I just spoke to Naresh before this and he's like, please make it as short as possible. So basically Naresh is a journalist based in Bombay. He's the consultant editor of Time Out, which has editions in Delhi, Bangalore and Bombay. Of course, he's the author of Taj Mahal Foxtrot, Story of Bombay's Jazz Age. And today he'll be leading us in a discussion, basically which deals with the effects of jazz on Bollywood music. So I'm guessing it's a very interesting topic and we all look forward to it. Hand over to Naresh now.
Good evening and thanks for coming. It's always lovely to be in Goa and have talk to a group of old friends and relatives and new friends. My book is called Taj Mahal Foxtrot and it's subtitled The Story of Bombay's Jazz Age. It covers the period 1935 to 1967. It's completely arbitrary. I sort of use these years. 1935 marks the beginning of marks the arrival of the first African American band, or the first all Negro band, as they were called at that time, to India. And 1967 is the arbitrary cutoff date. It marks the death of great trumpet player Chick Chocolate, who will feature in this presentation. But also it was the beginnings of rock and roll. So this is just a convenient narrative device. But I'm going to talk in this presentation about a certain time, mainly in the 40s and 50s, when jazz played an important role in influencing Hindi film music. Many of you all are going to see familiar faces here. There are people whose grandparents and parents feature in this. So feel free to interject and correct the mistakes I make and add stories as we go along. So since this is supposed to be about, that's in no way. So since this is about jazz in Bollywood or dance music in Bollywood, let's start with a sample of the evidence. We're going to watch a clip of a film called Albela. It was one of the biggest hits of 1951. It's a story of a poor man who's played by a guy called Bhagwan, who dreams of making it big on the theater stage. We're going to watch a song or a section of a song called Diwana Parwana. And in addition to watching it, listen to it. And you'll realize that as with the big band jazz arrangements of the 1950s, there are swinging clarinets and jazz drums and an intriguing trumpet solo. So that was Chick Chocolate, who we saw playing the trumpet. He was a famous Bombay band leader. Albela became so popular that Chick's band, the music makers, began to wear those frilly costumes even in their stage performances. In the 1940s and the 1950s, Chick performed everywhere. He was at the Taj. He was at the National Sports Club in Worli, just off Haji Ali. And he was at hotels like Hackman's in Missouri. His band was, as this clip attests, one of the finest in all of India. In addition to his trumpet playing, Chick also sang in a gravelly voice, and he was known as the Louis Armstrong of India. As this album cover shows, he actually bore a quite striking resemblance to the trumpet player from New Orleans, who was his idol. The appearance of Chick Chocolate and his music makers in Albela was unusual, but the use of big band jazz rhythms and instruments was actually quite common in Hindi films in the 1950s. You all know this song, for instance. It's Ina Mina Dika from the film Asha in 1957.
Ina mina dika, daida menika, maka naga naga, dika bika dika. Ina mina dika dika de, daida menika, maka naga dika bika rola dika. Ram pam poch, ram pam poch. दिल बेचूं है कोई लेने वाला, ऐसे वैसे को नहीं देने वाला. दिल बेचूं है कोई लेने वाला, ऐसे वैसे को नहीं देने वाला. सूरतिया हंसी हो, उमरिया जवा हो, कोई भी उसे देखे तो बस ये घुमा हो. यही है, यही है, यही तो है वो.
That sounded familiar. How did jazz come to Bollywood? That we have to travel back in time. It's 1935, and we're on the stage, and we're in the ballroom of the Taj Mahal Hotel in Bombay. On stage is Leon Abbey, a violinist from Minnesota, and his band. Leon Abbey caused a sensation when he came to Bombay because he led, to use the phrase prevalent at the time, the first all-Negro band to play in India. Creating musical history in distant lands seemed to rank high on Leon Abbey's list of priorities. In 1927, he'd taken his band on the road to Brazil and Uruguay, giving audiences in Rio and Sao Paulo and Montevideo their first taste of hot jazz straight from the source. When Leon Abbey set sail for India from Venice on September the 11th, 1935, the group he assembled had an immaculate pedigree. Emil Christian, the trombone player and the bass player, had been a member of the original Dixieland Jazz Band, which in 1917 had become the first jazz band ever to be recorded. On drums was Oliver Tynes, who had toured Scandinavia with the great Louis Armstrong in 1933, while the saxophone player, Cass McCord, had backed both Louis Armstrong and the mercurial saxophone player, Coleman Hawkins. This group landed in a city that was rising to its feet after the global economic depression that had started with the Wall Street crash of 1929. Buildings were coming up everywhere in Bombay, and many of them were in the new Art Deco style that had come to characterize the jazz age around the world. This, for instance, is a classic Bombay Art Deco building, the Eros Cinema, which I imagine many of you have seen. My favorite Art Deco building in Bombay is this one, Liberty Cinema. And if you look closely, you'll see that its facade has a keyboard all the way down it, a piano keyboard. And the keyboard characterizes the building. When you enter, it's on the woodwork, and it's on the curtain that rises and falls before and after the screening. As jazz became popular around the world, it was only natural that it would find its way to Bombay pretty soon. As a port city and as the largest city in the British Empire, Bombay had sought out the latest trends from around the world since the 1860s, when the city had made its fortunes trading cotton. Opera companies from Italy were regularly visiting Bombay in the second part of the 19th century. In 1922, the Parsi merchant J.B. Pettit decided to fund Bombay's first symphony orchestra, and the Bombay Symphony and Chamber Orchestra gave its first concert at the Excelsior Theatre in September 1922. This is not a picture of that orchestra, but I imagine many of these musicians did play in it, because this picture is from 1921, right around the time the orchestra was formed. All over the world, luxury hotels have served as a place where local elites were served up a taste of culture from the metropolitan centers of the West. So just like Shepherd's Hotel in Cairo and Raffles in Singapore, the Taj in Bombay prided itself on giving Bombay society the opportunity to savor the latest cultural trends from around the world. Its menus showcase the current culinary fashions, and the hotel had also taken upon himself to showcase the cultural phenomena of the moment. It had established a permanent Taj Mahal orchestra in 1907, and Victor Angel Ribeiro, who's here, his father was instrumental in setting up that orchestra. There you are. And so you can tell us something about that later. Here's a photo of the Taj Orchestra from 1935, the year that Leon Abbey came to town. I love this picture because of that extravagant Art Deco backdrop with the black buck and the woman who's carrying a pot of water on her head. If you look closely, you will see in the front row, on the left-hand side, or to your right, in the front row, that violinist, his name is Melli Mehta, and his son Zubin would grow up to be one of the most famous classical musicians on the planet. Melli Mehta actually also played in a smaller outfit at the Taj. And in 1935, he recorded this track with a sextet. I have to apologize for the scratchy quality of the recordings. These are pretty old, and many of them have been fished out of flea markets. And even though I've tried to clean them up, you can still hear a lot of crackle. But anyway, so let's get back to our story. It's clear that by 1935, Bombay was more than familiar with Western music of all sorts. As jazz, or hot music as it was being called at that time, became a global craze, it was only natural that it would find its way to Bombay pretty soon. There are no recordings of Leon Abbey in Bombay, but we know from newspaper reports at that time that he played a solid mixture of swing and rumbas that he'd picked up from his travels in Latin America. Though Bombay's upper classes welcomed the chance to foxtrot to the music that had caught the fancy of their counterparts all around the world, they complained that the change was too rapid. The Times of India reported, "His style was so new when Leon first played for us that many of the diehards insisted on simpler tunes and popular numbers. Leon Abbey had to make some adjustments," and the Times of India reported, "Their quick steps have slowed from parrot speed, the fastest in all the dancing world, to Bombay speed. They have toned down their hotting to meet the less sophisticated tastes of Bombay." But the Times seemed largely to approve of what Leon Abbey was doing. It said, "The band is teaching us in Bombay what rhythm really means." Leon Abbey seemed quite amused by the controversy. I met an old drummer, Percy Dias, who is in his 90s and lives in Delhi. And he's among the few people I met who had actually spoken to Leon Abbey. And he said, Leon Abbey said about this controversy, first they swore at my music, then they swore by my music. But Leon Abbey's visits opened the floodgate. His band left the Taj in 1935 after playing a single season there because, like so many other visitors to India, they found the heat and humidity difficult to take. But they were replaced by a band led by this guy, an American trumpet player named Cricket Smith. The most famous member of that outfit was the piano player Teddy Weatherford, who had won great acclaim in the US for his forceful style, which approached the piano almost like a trumpet player could. And so it was called the trumpet piano style. He ended up staying in India for almost a decade and made 70 recordings. In fact, he died in Calcutta in 1945 of cholera. And I went to Calcutta a few months ago to the book launch and went to look for his grave, which was in the Lower Circular Road Cemetery. Nobody had visited the grave, I think, in over a decade. So I had to, they keep a very good record. And so I was actually able to locate exactly where he was. And we cut through a little undergrowth and I placed a sprig of lilies on his grave. So if you should go to the Lower Circular Road Cemetery one of these days, maybe you'll find the wilting lilies there. But Leon Abbey made 70 recordings in India. And here's one of them. This is what he sounded like. Weren't only recording tunes they knew from America. They also started to write their own tunes. And so this bunch of guys, they called Cricket Smith and his Symphonians, wrote this tune. That was the Taj Mahal Foxtrot by Cricket Smith and his Symphonians. And that's the tune that gives my book its title. I chose it because I'm very intrigued by this picture. The the baritone who you heard was Creighton Thompson, and you can see him standing proudly on this corner. But the guy whose picture, who's not in this picture, his name is Mena Silas, and he's the guy who wrote the tune. He was actually a Baghdadi Jew from Bombay, and so Taj Mahal Foxtrot, or Taj Mahal a Foxtrot, I think is the first Indian hot tune ever recorded with an Indian influence, even though there are no Indian musicians on it. But these bands that were led by Cricket Smith and Teddy Weatherford played a really vital role in creating a jazz culture in India. Though Indian musicians such as Ken Mack had been playing swing music since the 1920s, they had learned to play jazz by reading the music scores and by listening to records. Having these great African-American musicians in town completely energized the scene. Both Cricket Smith and Teddy Weatherford recruited Indian musicians to play in their bands and taught them how to play jazz the American way. Among the first Indian musicians to play in the American bands was Joseph Menzies, a trumpet player named Frank Fernandes, and a saxophone player named Mickey Corea. Cheer from his relatives back there. By 1937, the band at the Taj had both Indians and African Americans. And soon, Indians were leading bands at the Taj themselves. In 1939, for instance, Mickey Corea began to lead the band at the Taj, and he would stay there until 1962. By the 1940s, Bombay had a vibrant jazz scene, sustained by enthusiastic dancers. In 1949, a concert program had carried this list of bands in Bombay. There were more than 60, and they start with the Alexander Band and end with the Zoroastrian Symphonians. So there was quite a range of people playing music in Bombay. But it wasn't all fun and games in Bombay at the end of the 1940s, especially if you were a jazz musician. Partition had brought tens of thousands of refugees to Bombay. Among them were scores of swing musicians who had made their living playing in the cantonments and hill stations in the parts of Punjab that had now become Pakistan. Suddenly there was a lot of competition for band jobs in Bombay. In addition, prohibition had gradually been introduced into Bombay state, so hotels were losing business. But also the jazz musicians were uncertain if the new India had a place for them culturally. Everywhere there was a suspicion of cultural forms that were considered to be colonial hangovers, and jazz was definitely among them. That's where the movies came to the rescue. Quite by coincidence, technological developments in this period allowed sound in the films to become much more sophisticated. Until 1931, Indian films had been silent, and in the early years, the talkies, as they were called, the music was recorded only by small groups of musicians, like this one. But to effectively convey the drama unfolding on stage, film soundtracks needed large orchestras, all playing together to emphasize the urgency of a car chase, to highlight the suspense of an impending murder, or to serenade a sweetly developing romance. Here there was a problem. Indian music, Indian classical music, both Hindustani and Carnatic, are melodic. So this means that the main performer plays a single melodic line and everybody else reiterates that line. On screen, this sounds pretty thin, but Western music is harmonic. The musicians in a band or an orchestra play notes of related pitches, which was what makes the group sound large and effective. Now, most of the composers of Hindi film scores, who are known in India as music directors, were trained in the Hindustani music tradition. People like Navsad and C. Ramchandra, or later Shankar and Jaikishan, and dozens of others, had a fabulous talent for creating memorable melodies. But to be translated into effective screen music, these melodies needed to be harmonized for a large orchestra. That's where the jazz musicians came in. Many of them were Goan Catholics and had received their musical training in the Western classical tradition in schools that had been set up by the Portuguese. And as you know, the Portuguese didn't leave until 1961. These Goan jazz musicians were among the few communities in India who knew all about harmony. So the composers of film music began to hire these jazz musicians as assistants to help them on their scores. This is how the work would proceed. The producer would organize a sitting, as the Goans, who couldn't speak very much Hindi, called baitaks, and the composer, who was most often a Hindu, and the lyricist, who was most often an Urdu-speaking Muslim, and the assistant would flop down on comfortable cushions and listen to the director narrate the plot. When the director indicated a point at which a song was necessary, the composer would hum out a melody or pick it out on his harmonium. It was the assistant's task to note down these fragments, which the composer would later piece together into an entire song. But the assistant would then add parts for the banks of violins, the horn sections, the piano, and the percussion. In the West, the assistant would have been called an arranger. He arranged the parts for the various bits of the orchestra. But the assistant wasn't merely taking dictation. It was his job to craft the introductions and the bridges between verse and chorus. Drawing from their bicultural heritage and their experience in the jazz bands, these Goans gave Bollywood music its promiscuous charm, slipping in slivers of Dixieland stomp, Portuguese fados, Ellington-esque doodles, cha-cha-cha, Mozart and Bach themes. In addition, the majority of the musicians in most Hindi film orchestras had been members of swing bands. That's because while sitars or flutes, basuris and other Indian instruments were often the lead instruments in these songs, the bulk of the instruments in the orchestras were clarinets and violins and trumpets, instruments that were needed to provide harmony. Also, for an orchestra to play effectively together, the musicians needed to be able to read notation of a score. The musicians who played the Indian instruments weren't able to do this because, as you know, Hindustani and Carnatic music has no system of notation. And so they had to rehearse their parts repeatedly until they had memorized them, and then they could play them. But the jazz musicians, with their training in the parochial schools, were all fluent readers of music scores. And this made the recording process much more efficient. Soon, the orchestras in the Hindi film studios weren't looking very different from the bands you'd see at the Taj. This, for instance, is Sri Ramchandra's recording orchestra in the 1940s. And the music they produced wasn't very different from the music you'd hear at the Taj and other Bombay venues. And to demonstrate that, we're going to watch a clip from a film nobody remembers. It's called Tarzan Comes to Delhi. And it features Dara Singh as Tarzan. But you're not really supposed to look at it. You're supposed to listen to it. It also features Bhagwan, the tribal chief, getting into the car. That was Tarzan Comes to Delhi. Among the first jazz musicians in the Hindi film studios was Frank Fernandes, who we met earlier. And here is an image of him rehearsing an orchestra. Perhaps the most famous music assistant was this man, who you all know, and let him tell you who he is.
My name is Anthony Gonzalez. मैं दुनिया में अकेला हूँ दिल भी है खाली घर भी है खाली इसमें रहेगी कोई किस्मत वाली और जिस मेरी याद आए जब चाहे चली आए जिस मेरी याद आए जब चाहे चली आए धूप में हम प्रेम गली थोड़ी नमस्कार होगी Excuse me, please. Oh, yeah! Anthony Gonzalez.
Oops, in the license you said go off at that. As everybody knows, Anthony, who passed away only a few months ago, was the music teacher of Lakshmikant and Pyare Lal, who composed the music for this film. And when the director said, we need a catchy name for our lead character, he offered the name of his violin teacher. Chick Chocolate, as we know, was also spending time in the film studios. He was an assistant to C. Ramchandra and to Madan Mohan and to many others. Here he is with another Goan musician who would dominate the film world, the impossibly young Lata Mangeshkar. And also you can see Muhammad Rafi in that. I'm fascinated by this period of film history. To begin with, this was world music being created every day in the Hindi film studios, long before the term world music had even been invented. But in addition, this music echoed the dreams of the newly independent India. Hindu composers and Muslim lyricists and Goan Catholic musicians were sitting together in the studios every day, demonstrating through music that it was actually possible to find a way to bridge our differences. I'm going to leave you with a fragment of that sound with a song you've all probably heard. It's Gore Gore from Samadhi in 1950. But the next time you listen to it, perhaps you listen more carefully to the Chick Chocolate trumpet solo. And you'll smile because you know about the long journey it's taken to get there from the Taj Mahal Hotel in downtown Bombay. Only a few miles down the road to a recording studio somewhere in central Bombay via New Orleans and New York.
छोड़ो छोड़ो दिया न तोड़ो किसी और को जलाया करो गोरी गोरी ओ बाकी छोरी चाहे रोज बुलाया करो गोरे गोरे ओ बाकी छोरे कभी मेरी गली आया करो गोरी गोरी ओ बाकी छोरी चाहे रोज बुलाया करो
Thanks a lot. So I'll take questions for a few moments if anybody has any.
Research across a fantastic jazz keyboardist called Dizzy Sal. Because I met him in Bangalore, and I didn't hear you mention him at all, but I wasn't sure about his background.
Right, so he forms a later chapter in my book in the 1960s. Everybody here is nodding, so they know Dizzy Sal. Dizzy Sal was, for people who don't remember, was born Edward Saldana, and his family was from Burma, and then they moved to Bangalore after the war, or during the war. But he came to Bombay in the 1950s and was the reigning deity at the Ambassador Hotel, which still exists. They have a place called the Other Room, which had a lot of music. And the Ambassador was presided over by an ebullient Greek owner whose name was Jack Voyansis, who always was chomping on a cigar, everybody said. The Other Room, there are no children here, evidently was noted for its profusion of well-endowed women, and so the musicians would call it the other room. But Dizzy Sal was playing there one day in 1958, and by the 1950s, the Americans had started using jazz as a Cold War weapon. They wanted to win the hearts and minds of people around the world, and they figured out that jazz was an effective tool. It was played by colored people, and so for us in the third world, this was an example of American democracy in action. Even though, the Soviets were feeding us this propaganda about blacks not being allowed to vote and being segregated in the American South, they sent us a jazz band. Maybe we would believe that, Americans weren't so evil after all. And so the CIA, as it turns out, was funding these programs. They were also funding magazines around the world, including one in India called Quest, that was in its early years edited by Nitin Ezekiel. But that's off on a tangent. So the first Cold War weapon to arrive in India was Dave Brubeck, who many of you all have heard. And so Dave Brubeck was, the musicians remember him because he and his musicians wandered up and down what was then called Churchgate Street, what is today called Veer Nariman Road, where there was a profusion of restaurants that featured jazz trios and jazz quartets. And one day he heard Dizzy Sal play and said, "You're so good, I'm going to send you on a scholarship to America." And he did. He sent him to Berkeley. And to find out what happened after that, you have to run out and buy many copies of my book. Yeah. It's almost impossible to find out who played on which tracks, and this was really a sort of factory operation. You got booked for the shift you went in, and people just played whatever score was put in front of them. One of the intriguing things about the way Goan musicians approached this is they all really saw themselves as jazz musicians who had sort of demeaned themselves by having to play in the studios, playing this awful Hindi film music that they didn't actually like. And so they played a really important role in creating these songs that millions of Indians love and hum. But to them, this was not really important. And few of them actually would go to see the films after they were screened. And so it's a really astonishing thing that all of India loves these songs. These guys played a really important role in creating them, but they didn't care for them.
And does your book tell the story of Dizzy Sal and Shirley Myers?
Aha. No.
That was really a story.
Tell it.
No, I won't tell it. I knew quite a lot about it at that time because we were part of the jazz scene in Bombay.
Where did you play?
No, I didn't play. I used to be one of those who paid to listen.
Okay. Which was the place
At the other room, when Dizzy Sal began, Jack Boyansis gave us an hour from 8 to 9 before the other room opened to its regular patrons. And they were just all jazzmen over there listening to Dizzy Sal. It was absolutely outstanding. And what you said about Dave Brubeck is really true. He came back from Berkeley and then he kind of stopped playing. He disappeared. And everyone put it down to his, not infatuation. He was more than besotted with Shirley Myers, and I think that took the mickey out of his playing, I think.
He was a man of great passion. But yeah, so in fact, he and Shirley Myers had started to play together. He came to Bombay because the band leader Ken Mack, whose picture we saw earlier, was putting together a group, and he advertised for a piano player and a singer. And that group was called 3 Hits and a Miss, the miss being Shirley Myers.
Interestingly, in Bollywood, we've seen a lot of music being copied.
right from classical music and even today, but not many jazz tunes were copied. So would it be fair to say that jazz progressed naturally without many tunes being copied?
This is always this debate about copying, and I think some tunes were copied, but there's also a jazz convention of quotation. So Charlie Parker, for instance, would slip in a bit of Bizet here. And when you listen to these tunes often, they use them as a springboard for their imagination. So you start off with the sliver of something that's very familiar, and then the way it progresses, it becomes something entirely of its own. And so I think that was happening a lot too. That they would take popular standards and then really make it their own.
Nice, not specifically to do with your book, but something that intrigues me is that, pop jazz has inspired a lot of music, both in Bollywood and otherwise as well in India. How come further developments in jazz didn't really, they haven't influenced very much in, our part of the world?
So, as I began to research this book, I realized that Bombay and India, since the 1850s, with the development of the steamship and all of that, was adopting what was current in the West very quickly. So, like I said, we had opera companies in Bombay, but also in Calcutta in the 1880s. Among the most intriguing things I found was the presence of minstrelsy music, where white people put on blackface to perform caricatures of Negro life. And those were very popular in India in the 1880s too. A little later, light opera and then classical music became popular. So India was always importing whatever was new in the West. So when jazz became new, especially Dixieland and swing, that's what India took. A little later, rock and roll became popular. And so that's what India moved on to. And so this is what I've seen, that, we take the thing and then run with it, and the last thing gets frozen in time or discarded. I'm not sure that's a satisfying answer, but...
Can I ask you about what is the present jazz scene in India? I mean, is there a Churchgate Street, or is there, what's happening? What's on the scene right now?
There isn't. And so there are older musicians whose parents played the music who continue to perform it. Many of them now live in Goa. You're lucky to have some of the legends living here. But younger musicians have moved on. They're doing hip-hop and electronica and whatever it is that their grandfathers would have wanted them to do, to move with the times. And all over the world, jazz has become a pretty niche interest, even in America. So it's not unusual, I think, that jazz, the music scene in India has also moved on.
Would you subscribe to the view that, in a sense, Bollywood destroyed the jazz scene in Bombay by virtue of the fact that they offered so much money to the musicians that they gradually moved away from playing in nightclubs? And then the hotels couldn't match it, and it just disappeared. By 67, as you say, there were no more jazz groups, which began with orchestras, ended up with trios and quartets, and then until the synthesizer came on. Now you've got a one-man band.
Right. I think it was more complex than that. I think first there was a taxation regime in Bombay that made it more expensive to have live music. And then prohibition made it less fun to listen to music. But also, musicians actually say that even if it did kill the jazz scene, and I'm not sure it did, it sure as hell kept them alive. Bollywood was where they found, where they got their bread and butter, when there were no clubs to play at. But again, it was changing popular taste. People wanted to listen to chaps with shoulder-length hair and drainpipe trousers waggling their pelvises. They didn't want to listen to men with saxophones. Well, thanks a lot. I'd like to thank the Sunaparanta Center for having me here, to Literature Live for doing this collaboration, and to everybody for coming out.
We'd like to thank Naresh. That was a really informative and entertaining presentation. So thank you very much for being here. The Taj Mahal Foxtrot is available on sale, and it's a special Sunaparanta price, so for those interested. Colin will not be playing. There was some kind of a misunderstanding, and on our part, there was no communication that he was going to be playing, so I'm sorry if anyone expected that to be happening. It's not. And we'd like to invite you to some refreshments, and have a great evening. Thank you.